Welcome back to The Explainer. Imagine, just for a second, if your local supermarket had its own private army. Imagine if they printed their own currency and occasionally just decided to conquer a small country to keep the price of nutmeg down. Sounds completely unhinged, right? Well, this is the ultimate cautionary tale of how a mega corporation essentially acted like a tyrannical state, and, as you'll see, how an empire built on a super fragile foundation of pure greed inevitably turns to dust. Get ready because this is going to completely change how you view massive corporations. So, who actually was the richest company in history? I mean, if you're picturing modern tech giants or massive oil cartels, scratch that. You're way off. The real answer is a 17th century spice syndicate. Yep, spices. They weren't selling smartphones or software. They were literally slinging pepper and nutmeg. Yet, they possessed the absolute power to wage wars and mint their own money.
400%. I want you to just let that sink in. That was the staggering profit margin for a single early Dutch expedition to the Maluku Islands back in 1598. Imagine investing $100 and getting 400 back. That is mouth-watering wealth. It was exactly the kind of money that easily convinced men to brave the terrifying, totally unpredictable high seas and risk their actual lives.
Part 1. The richest company ever. The story really starts with Dutch merchants finding themselves completely suffocated by a Spanish and Portuguese trade monopoly. Since those empires closed the doors to trade, the Dutch essentially decided, well, let's just blow up the wall and make our own doors. So, in 1602, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was born. But listen, this wasn't just a regular business. This was an empire wearing a corporate suit. As the world's first multinational corporation, it was granted these terrifying quasi-governmental powers. They had the legal right to execute convicts, negotiate international treaties, and, no joke, literally conquer entire nations.
Moving on to part 2, financial innovation, sharing risks.
You know how they say greed breeds innovation? Well, back then, funding a single ship was a massive gamble. We're talking high risks of piracy, shipwrecks, deadly diseases. If your one ship sank, you were entirely ruined. Driven by HERS, which is that intense, unending greed and fear of loss, they came up with the brilliant concept of pooled investments. By gathering money from multiple investors and spreading it across entire fleets, they completely neutralized the risk. One ship goes down, no big deal, the profits from the others cover the loss. And just like that, out of pure, unadulterated financial self-interest, the modern stock market was born. Which brings us to part 3, military expansion and monopoly. Now that they had basically unlimited funding, the rivalry between the Dutch and the English East India Company heated up. And this wasn't settled with price-matching guarantees or boardroom court battles, okay? It was settled with blood. This intense corporate war culminated in the horrific 1623 Ambane incident, where the VOC literally tortured and executed English merchants over suspicions of treason. The corporate boardroom had entirely stripped away any kind of moral boundary. They were adopting ruthless, warlord tactics just to secure total market dominance. And their aggressive global expansion moved at terrifying speed. Founded in 1602, they established a post in Banten by 1603, completely seized Jakarta, renaming it Batavia in 1611, and set up the Cape Colony in South Africa by 1652 just to resupply their massive fleets. They violently pushed out the Portuguese and even secured exclusive monopolistic trading rights at Dejima in Japan. They were the undisputed masters of the ocean, period. Part 4. Peak glory. Unimaginable profits. By 1669, their stats were genuinely terrifying. Look at this. 150 colossal merchant ships, 40 heavily armed warships, 50,000 employees, backed up by a private mercenary army of 10,000 soldiers. And for the investors back home, a massive 40% annual dividend. By all worldly metrics, they had literally won the game of capitalism. They reached the absolute pinnacle of global power. But here is the ultimate plot twist. When a company literally possesses everything, unlimited money, private armies, and global monopolies, how exactly do they ruin it all? How do you lose when you have the cheat codes? Well, the answer is a toxic cocktail of corporate bloat, disastrous business pivots, and the utter blindness that infects an institution when it is entirely consumed by hubris and unbridled greed.
We are looking at possibly the worst strategic pivot in business history. In the old days, they sold spices at a really low volume, but with an astronomical profit margin. But as European tastes shifted and new competitors arrived, they panicked. They completely pivoted to tea, coffee, and sugar. The catch? These are low-margin products. They demand massive volume just to turn a profit. Suddenly, they had to double the size of their fleet and take on enormous debt just to compete. They were running twice as fast just to stay in the exact same place. Part 5. The decline. Greed and corruption. They basically transformed into this bloated corporate dinosaur, eating vastly more than it could ever digest. Between 1680 and 1720, they massively expanded operations, increasing their shipping tonnage by an incredible 125%. It was a monumental effort. But profits? Profits only increased by 78%. The crushing operating costs, the debt interest, the massive payroll, it completely swallowed their margins whole. And the situation back in the corporate offices was actually far worse than out at sea. Leadership became highly incompetent, relying entirely on nepotism rather than, actual skill. Rampant corruption spread like a virus among employees who focused solely on lining their own pockets at the company's expense. And the extreme financial mismanagement, it meant they were taking out massive loans just to pay out dividends to their shareholders. They were essentially running a 1700s corporate Ponzi scheme. But nothing highlights their utter moral bankruptcy quite like the 1740 Batavia massacre. Triggered by mere rumors, the company enacted an unprecedented wave of violence that wiped out over 10,000 members of the city's Chinese community. This wasn't some kind of administrative error. It was pure, horrific thom, unjust, bloody oppression. It permanently stained their reputation, proving that blood money never lasts, and the cosmic scales of justice, they always balance out eventually. Finally, Part 6. The inevitable end. Bankruptcy. When a tree is entirely hollowed out from the inside by termites, which in this case is greed and corruption, it really only takes a single strong gust of wind to knock the whole thing over. That wind came in 1780 with the outbreak of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. The VOC, already rotting internally, met the rising might of the British Royal Navy, and it was an absolute slaughter. The British easily destroyed their fleets and seized their trade outposts. With crushing debt eliminating any chance of recovery, they proved that military force without moral or financial stability is just an illusion.
1796, the year the curtain finally fell. The VOC was formally nationalized, and the once most powerful corporate and military entity on Earth was declared utterly bankrupt. It was a pretty pathetic whimper of an ending, buried under a mountain of debt and a historically terrible reputation.
So it leaves us with this. When an empire is built solely on endless greed and dole, isn't its destruction inevitable? It doesn't matter if it's a nation or a megacorporation. Corrupt wealth is incredibly fleeting. Empires built on oppression will always eventually collapse under their own weight. Think about that the next time you see a massive corporation acting like it's simply too big to fail. Thanks for watching The Explainer, and we'll see you in the next one.